それではお待たせいたしました。これからすでに一部の報道で論じられていることで皆さんも興味がおありかと思いますけれども、オリンパスの元社長でこれまでオリンパスの不正について数々発言され調査もされてきましたマイケル・ウッドフォード元社長が緊急記者会見をしたいということで今日お招きしました。これからマイケル・ウッドフォード元社長の決意といいますか、これまでのいきさつを踏まえたご自分の説明をしていただいた後にですね、会場からの質疑応答をしたいと思います。私は当クラブ企画委員の今日の司会をさせていただきますテレビ朝日の川村と言います。よろしくお願いします。
Thank you all for your patience. Thank you all for turning out on short notice. As you've probably heard through several media reports already, Michael Woodford, who was relieved of his duties as president at Olympus for pointing out past indiscretions and misbehavior at the company, is joining us today to answer your questions and bring you up to date about his life and plans.
そして一応これを、プレスコンファレンスですので、オフレコとかそういうことは一切ございませんが、なるべくであれば日本記者クラブで、会見をしたというクレジットを入れていただければ幸いでございます。それではマイケル・ウッドフォードさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
Everything is on the record here today, but we would be grateful for acknowledging the venue in any reports. Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, thank you. Konnichiwa. And thank you for having me today and hosting this meeting. I appreciate that. It's 12 weeks exactly today since I was dismissed on the 14th of October. And this wasn't the happy ending of the story which I would have chosen. And I'd like to explain to you why I've reached this decision.
本日は私は10月14日社長を解職されてからちょうど12週間になりますが、ご存知の通りハッピーエンディングだとは言い難い形になっています。この結論に至っての背景について本日少しお話しさせていただきたいと思います。
I was asked this morning, was there one moment where I had a realization that I should withdraw? And that moment started 3 weeks ago in this room at the press conference.
この結論になるでしょうと振り返ってみて、いつ頃だったでしょうかと今朝ほど質問を受けたんですが、私も考えてみたらちょうど3週間前にこの部屋に行った時でした。
Let me explain because it's very important to me. When I tried to raise this issue of concern while I was still the president and the chief executive of Olympus, I wrote 6 letters between the 23rd of September and the 11th of October. And those letters went to all my board colleagues, as well as the company's auditors and their senior partners around the world.
さて、私はまだ社長を務めていた頃、9月23日から10月11日にかけて、6通にわたって役員同士全員宛てに、またその6通目から関税法人宛てにも重大の不正の疑いについての手紙を出しました。
I had a number of concerns in relation to the governance of the company and what the company had been doing in relation to its mergers and acquisitions policy.
特に企業統治の上で オリンパスの過去の M&A 活動について大変懸念している点がありました。
But I just chose two issues which I thought would be easy to comprehend and illustrate the problem. And they were that Olympus had bought three companies, which I've called the Mickey Mouse companies. This is the face cream and the microwave dishes. And those companies, Olympus paid $800 million US. And also that the company, in relation to the fees, they called it fees in relation to the acquisition of Gyrus, $700 million for fees to unknown parties, and then pay the money through the Cayman Islands.
私の懸念の対象は多岐にわたるものでしたが、分かりやすくするために2点に絞って指摘しました。一つはうちの本業と全く無縁の3社の買収にあたって支払われた8億ドル。もう一つはイギリスの会社の買収に関して支払われたとても不明ないわゆる顧問料の7億ドルでした。
Those two transactions amount to $1.5 billion, or 5 years' profits of the entire corporation, a huge amount.
つまり15億ドルの総額でした。言ってみれば我が社の約5年間の利益相当の金額でした。
Now, even with the smallest amount of business acumen, and I'm sure everyone in this room would know that you don't pay $800 million for companies with no turnover, and you don't pay unknown parties $700 million for advice and then pay it through the Cayman Islands. It's not subtle, it's not complicated, it's very basic, and it's so obviously wrong.
経営の素人でも分かるように売上というほどの売上のない3社について買収額として8億ドル払ったり相手先分からないかつケイマン諸島経由に7億ドルのいわゆる顧問料を払ったりすることはとても不自然な行為でした。
So I had hoped when that was going to be discussed at a board meeting, large numbers of the directors of Olympus would see that there was at least evidence, overwhelming evidence, frankly, that these questions should be looked into. But the whole board, including the president of Olympus's current president, Mr. Takayama, voted immediately for my dismissal and told me to get the bus to the airport.
さて、こういった懸念を議題に役員会が開催されたとき、当然少なくとも一部の役員はこれに関して関心を示すだろうと思ってたところ、なんと実際出席してみたところ全員一致で私の会食に手を挙げた。かつどうぞ空港までリムジンバスで行きなさいと。
So that was Friday, the 14th of October. On Saturday, the 15th, the Financial Times breaks the story on its front page, and it's across the world.
会食されたのは10月14日の金曜日でした。翌日の15日にフィナンシャルタイムズで大きく報道されて、全世界で大きなニュースになりました。
But Olympus directors lie. They lied about the payments. They argued it was half the size or 15%, not 35% of the value, and obfuscate and very extraordinary that they tried to defend the indefensible. But eventually, Kikukawa, after sounding like Colonel Gaddafi in strange diatribes he gives out and to the Japanese employees, tells people that Michael doesn't like Japan, all sorts of mistruths and black propaganda, But eventually, he leaves the company for the good of the company, supposedly.
当初は菊川会長をはじめに全役員が、まるで臭いものに蓋のような反応でごまかしたり嘘ついたりしてみましたが、結局ごまかしきれなくなって菊川さん自身が退場することになりました。
So Kikukawa stands down as president, representative director, but stays as a director of the company. And Mr. Takeyama becomes the new president, comes to a meeting like this, bows deeply, says what he says was one of the first things which shocked me. He said, these payments, and again, this is several weeks into the story now, these payments were appropriate. It was appropriate to pay $800 million for the three companies with no turnover. It's appropriate that we paid these fees in relation to Gyrus because this company knew what they were doing and insult to the injury by saying, and they were good value.
さて、菊川さんが去った後、社長として登場してきた竹山新社長も皆さんの前に一応お辞儀をした上でその不自然な支払いについてごまかしたりむしろ正当化しようとしたりしました。
Yes. Then the Asahi Weekly breaks the story, and Takeyama says, Mr. Mori went to see the panel, and sorry, it was a tabashi, and the share prices collapse.
さてついに週刊朝日さんが大きく取り上げて森副社長がやっぱり白状したことが皆様にバレてしまいました。
Now, if that had been in any other capitalist market in the world, Takeyama at the press conference would have been literally had fruit thrown at him. The headlines would be idiot, liar, fool. How can he have said these payments were appropriate? How can he have said they were good value? But he stays.
その不自然な支払いを正当化しようとしていた高山社長ですが、正直言って日本以外の先進国だったら記者会見で皆さんの前でそんなこと言おうとすればむしろ物を投げられたりして次の日の新聞の見出しに嘘つきとか出てけというような見出しが登場しているのは当然なんですが、なぜか日本ではそういうふうになってません。
Now you have the overseas shareholders, when the tabashi has been admitted and they've seen the statements made by Takeyama, and they came out very explicitly, this board of directors must go, including the largest overseas shareholder, Southeastern, Harris Associates in the United States, and others. Very clear they should go. But the Japanese institutional shareholders don't say anything. And the share price is down at this stage by almost 80%.
さて、オリンパスの経営陣自ら設置した第三者委員会も海外の機関投資家も現役員たち全員辞めるべきと大きな声で呼びかけましたが、残念ながら日本の国内の機関投資家の株主さんたちはみんな沈黙を守り続けました。
So, again, I was disorientated that you can do this and survive. But Olympus say they had commissioned an independent committee chaired by a retired Supreme Court judge, Kainaka, and that it would abide by its findings.
さて、私はこの実情を見てて信じられない気持ちでした。こんなことを言いながらも明らかに嘘だったことが明らかになっても首が飛べないのは不思議でした。
On the 6th of December, last month, just a few weeks ago, the independent committee reports, and the report was very clear, very explicit in its language. It held to account the Ringi members of Kikukawa, Mori, and Yamada, but it also made clear in relation to the other directors, to quote, they were a group of yes men. That is the only way Kikukawa had been able to do these things with Mori. Takayama, for example, had been on the board when it approved the 800 and the 700. So yes men, they were tainted, they were contaminated, and they should go.
繰り返しになりますが、自らが設置した第三者委員会が、ついに12月6日に報告書を発表したときに、もちろん菊川さん、森副社長、山田監査役について断罪もありましたが、彼らだけじゃなくて、その他のすべての役員についても、イエスメンの文化というような言い方で、全員に責任があったと、大変厳しい指摘がありました。
So I thought, perhaps very naively, that the Japanese institutional shareholders would now speak out. They had said in some statements that they were waiting for the panel to report. On the day after the panel, on the 7th of December, at a press conference given by Olympus, Takayama again bowed deeply, apologized, and as reported in the Nikkei and all the other media, both domestic and overseas, that there was a recognition that they all had to leave. It was only an issue of timing.
第三者委員会の報告書が発表された6日の翌日の12月7日にオリンパスの方で記者会見が開かれました。そこで高山社長がまたも皆さんの前に立ってお詫びしました。また、やはり自分を含めて全員がいずれ辞めなきゃいけないというふうに解釈された発言しました。
Most of you here would have been here 3 weeks ago, because a week after the panel's report and Olympus's statement that they would go as directors, the existing directors would all go. On the Friday, the day I gave my last press conference in this room, I was horrified to hear, and anyone who saw me that day would have sensed my anger and my frustration. Takayama had said, hold on, no, I didn't say I was resigning, I was misreported. He blamed the media for misreporting. We've initiated another independent committee to apportion responsibility. And when pushed, and many of the Japanese media, really some of the people were here, pushed him for an answer. And I saw the transcript, and the lady from the Nikkei business was very persistent, very focused, very targeted. Takayama would not now say he was going and admitted that other directors may stay. Now, only in Japan can you have companies appointing an independent committee, but if it doesn't like it, it will produce another independent committee. Now, the only reason they can do this, and this is why that day was so important, is with the tacit approval of the Japanese institutional shareholders. 3 weeks ago at this meeting, I told you that one of the key players in this was Sumitomo Mitsui, which is Olympus's bank, and it's the largest creditor of Olympus, and it's also was responsible for the syndication of the loans.
さて、3週間前に私ここで皆さんにお会いしたときに、その直前に高山さんはまたも皆さんの前に立ってお話ししたばかりでした。その時は彼は、いや、辞めるとは言ってませんでしたと。辞めませんと。で、私はとっても皆さんよく対応してくださったと思ったのは、報道の方々は結局、 それに対して強くしつこく追及してくださった。しかし彼は同じほどしつこくやはりそのこと言ってませんと言ったと私は聞いております。これは日本ならでは、失礼いたしました。またその時、記者会見で辞めないだけじゃなくて、またも新たに委員会を設置すると。これ日本ならではの話なんですが、やはりいわゆる第三者委員会を設けて、その報告書を待つと。その報告書が上がってきた時、その内容を気に食わなければ、じゃあ違う委員会をまた組みましょうということになるんです。これは日本特有の問題だと私は見てます。オリンパスの銀行についてお話ししたいと思うんですが、三井住友銀行さんがメインバンクですが、貸し手だけじゃなくて引き受け業務も多く扱っていらっしゃるし、もちろん株主でもあります。
So I had written to the President, Mr. Kinube, asking for a meeting and just pointing out that I had been responsible for the disclosure of a company of which they were a shareholder of $1.5 billion and asking just to meet.
私はここで皆さんを愛したとき、この公の場を借りて、国部頭取さん宛てに呼びかけました。私に会ってくださいと。またその日のうちに彼宛てに正式に手紙を出しました。その旨の手紙を。
Mr. Kinube at least had the courtesy of responding, and on the Monday, my representatives in Tokyo received a call from the branch manager of the West Shinjuku branch of Sumitomo Mitsui, and passed on the message from Mr. Kinube that he couldn't meet with me because Olympus had set up its management reform committee. Now, that management reform committee, the members of that were chosen by the discredited directors, and the chairman of that committee, as reported in Reuters, is an individual with strong links to Sumitomo Mitsui. So it speaks for itself in relation to its independence.
少なくとも国部頭取さんは私にきちんと返事をくださったんです。その翌週の月曜日に西新宿支店から私の日本の弁護団の事務所に電話がありまして、オリンパスさんの方で経営改革委員会を設置したばかりで、その委員会が調査を進めている最中ですので、このタイミングではちょっと遠慮させてもらいますと。しかし、その改革委員会は、そのロイターズ通信の報道によれば、非常にやはり三井住友銀行に非常に近い人物が会長を務めていました。
So, the situation we have is that the Japanese institutional shareholders is the reason these directors are still there. Without their support, they couldn't be. And what is public and known and factual is, despite one of the biggest scandals in history, the Japanese institutional shareholders have not spoken one single word of criticism, in complete and utter contrast to overseas shareholders who were demanding accountability, that the directors who sat in on those board meetings, received warnings in the most explicit way, left.
さて、ここで大きな問題があからさまになってきましたね。いわゆる名ばかりの独立第三者委員会、しかし全然独立性のないものです。また、会社に対して一言も言えない株主、つまり国内の機関投資家です。海外の機関投資家が大きな声を上げているにもかかわらず、これだけ大きな不正に対して、不正の疑いに対して、国内の機関投資家、オリンパスの株主のうち、声を上げた一社もありませんでした。
So that was the point where I had a realization that, I'm a businessman. I run companies. I can make them more efficient, more profitable, marketing, R&D, sales. But I can't change that situation with the Japanese institutional shareholders. The cross-shareholding, which allows this to happen, where the rule is you never criticize, as we've just seen with Olympus, despite a scandal of 1.5 billion, despite the share price at one stage being down by almost 80%. The only people who can do that are the people who are watching this on television or reading your journals. That's the Japanese nation, that's the Japanese public. It's a democracy, and the only way that can be changed is by the public talking to their politicians to make sure there's legislation in place which stops this incestuous club. That I couldn't do. I can't do that. And because I can't change it, it was that realization that even if I had won the proxy fight, I would have left a situation where there was a fracture between overseas shareholders and the Japanese institutional shareholders. I'm sure many individual shareholders, including employees of Olympus, would have voted on my side, my alternative slate. But this large block of shareholding meant that if I'd come back, even as with a majority, Olympus's main bank and creditor wouldn't want me, didn't want me. And I don't want to see that for Olympus. It would not be healthy. It would be just the wrong way to build any future. And it was that realization which made me start talking to people. Last night in my hotel bedroom, I had people crying, asking me not to do it. And their point was, you know, there's the FBI investigation going on, there's the SFO, the Serious Fraud Office going on, there's a large investigation going on by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police and the prosecutors. Why do anything? Why not just wait? Because there will be further revelations. But I explained again, even if I win, do I want to come back where the Japanese institutional shareholders have not spoken one word of support for doing the right thing, and not one word of criticism, which is even more extraordinary to me and people who are looking in to this country. So, sorry.
率直に申し上げて、私にはできることは大いにあります。事業会社の経営を任せていただければ、私は生産性を上げたり、利益率を上げたりしていく自信はあります。一方、私にはできないこともあります。で、特に今話してきたような株式の持ち合い制度としてのもう本当に一枚岩の姿勢を崩していくことは一人ではできません。日本の足かせになっているこの制度を打ち破っていけるのは皆様の読者、皆様の視聴者です。つまり日本の国民が立ち上がってやっていただくしかありません。私はプロクシーファイトを進め続けたら勝つことはできたかもしれません。しかし仮に勝てたとしても残念ながらまさに内外の線で分かれて海外の投資家賛成、国内の機関投資家反対という残念な形になってしまったはずです。私がそのような形で社長として復職しても、私の復職を歓迎しないメインバンクと一緒に仕事をやっていけるかとか、それは決して会社にとっていい状態ではなかったでしょう。昨夜、私のホテルの部屋で相次いでの方とお会いして相談したりしました。元同僚、元部下、投資家の方、役員候補として名前を挙げてくださった方、いろんな方とお話ししまして、その多くはまずはやめないでください。戦い続けてください。ほら、英、米、日でそれぞれ当局が一生懸命調査を進めています。新しい事実は必ず出てきます。もうちょっと待ってくださいと言われました。
So I arrived back home in England after that Friday here and tell my wife the story that Mr. Takayama now may be staying and other directors may be staying and the Japanese shareholders do not say anything. And she is an intelligent woman, and she says to me, why? Because even if you win, and she knew how important this was to me, even if you win, you go back to a situation where such a big constituent of the company shareholders are so united. Please don't do that. Please don't make myself and the family go through any more, because it's without purpose now. You must see that. That's how we find ourselves here today.
私は確かにいろいろ複雑な考えありました。ただ、私の妻自身が私によく泣きながら言ってた通り、そのようなことをしてどうなるんですか、私たちは。そのようなことをしてあなた自身はどうなるんですかと。歓迎されないところでどうして突っ込んでいくんですかと。ついに彼女の論理にやはり説得されまして、本日に至りました。
それではこれから質疑応答に入りますけれども、まず私の方から今の胸の内を率直に語っていただきまして本当にありがとうございます。
Thank you for your very frank account of your recent experience.
それでもやはり、日本人の一人として何かわだかまりが残るんですけれども、それはやはり日本企業の古い体質といいますか、その前近代制にここまで戦ったのに、断念をされたということで、今後何か明るさが見えるとすれば何を期待されているのかをまず率直にお伺いしたいと思うんですが。
Okay, you've provided a gripping indictment of the pre-modern state of Japanese corporate governance. I'd like to ask you if you perceive any basis for optimism, what it might be.
Again, I had hoped after the independent panel had spoken that the right thing would have been done, and the independent panel served Japan well. Outside of this country, the language was understood, and that the Supreme Court Justice and his colleagues had spoken. But the story is, the reality is, that Takayama is still the president of Olympus, with his other 10 colleagues who are all there, are all responsible. And I'm taking the plane and saying goodbye to Japan as a businessman, not as a human being. I will come back many times, I know.
まずちょっと認識として改めて申しますが、元最高裁の判事の下で設置された第三者委員会は本当にいい仕事してくださいました。この場を借りてもう一回これを確認させていただきたい。第三者委員会は本当に立派でした。で、その報告書が発表されたとき、これで今度こそ変わるでしょうと私も一瞬思いました。しかし、今日になってどういう状況なのか見てみましょう。私はあさって飛行機に乗って帰ることになっています。また、私の元同僚、高山さんプラスあと10人の役員は依然としてその座に座り続けています。
So, to be very honest with you, this story, if any story was going to be different, it would be this story, because of the nature of what had taken place, the scrutiny of the world's media, the involvement of law enforcement agencies around the world, yet these men are still in the directors of Olympus, and it comes over to the world like an Alice in Wonderland, a bizarre situation, and I get fired and lose my job and for doing the right thing, and they're still there. So I feel very pessimistic I'm an optimist by character, but I feel very pessimistic that the story's ended. I had a dinner a few weeks ago on the eve of the last press conference, and I asked them how many believed that I would come back to this country as the president of Olympus, and only one person put their hand up out of a large group, and that person did it only to be nice to me. And so I don't see anything to be optimistic about. The one thing I would say is that talking with the politicians from both the major parties, I was impressed at their understanding of the issues. And if Japan legislates, and I know already there'll be the professional lobby against, but if Japan could legislate, and it would need a long time period to say cross-shareholding is negative, it's bad for this country, not simply as an issue of governance, but more relevantly, it allows boards of companies which are underperforming, badly managed, to stay there forever. There's no hostile takeover in Japan, basically. It's all got to be consensual. And it doesn't, I don't mean overseas hostile takeovers, I mean even domestic. And without that, you lose one of the principal safeguards of capitalism, which if a company underperforms, then another company will come in, pay the shareholders a premium, and get rid of the directors. In this case, it wasn't even that. It was simply changing the board of directors who had totally discredited themselves, as reported by a Supreme Court judge. But we know the end of the story, and it's not that.
今おっしゃるように、
Sorry.
明るい材料をここで提供してあげたい気持ちは山ほどありますが、オリンパスのこの案件は、今おっしゃったような前近代的な体制を打ち破って、新しい風を吹かそうと思えば、絶好の機会でしたはずです。考えてみましょう。全世界のメディアが注目してました。各国の当局が調査を進めてました。しかし、結果として、正しいことをやろうとした人が解職されました。不正から目をそらした人たちは役員職に残っています。まるで不思議な国のアリスの世界です。私はあえて言うなら、私たち自民党また民主党の分科会でお話しさせていただきましたが、その時とても心強い言葉をいただきました。本当にそれぞれの先生方は、とてもこの企業統治の問題について強い問題意識を持っていらっしゃるし、本当に一生懸命取り組んでいらっしゃる姿に私は感動しました。まさにこれから、長期的な課題ではありますが、今から着手して、法的な制度を改定して、株式の持ち合い制度を基本的になくしていくことによって、日本の経済の活性化を図ることができます。
どうもありがとうございました。問題は非常に根深く、日本のいわば株式の問題、もたれ合い、日本型資本主義というんでしょうか、そういうところまで、お考えになっていることを改めて認識した次第ですけれども、これから会場からの質問を受けたいと思いますので、挙手の上、所属とお名前を言ってから質問をお願いします。
Mr. Woodford has given us a marvelous look into the underside of Japanese capitalism. He's provided lots of grist for our mill. I hope that we can now have some good questions from all of you. Please.
どうぞ一番前の方。
朝日新聞出版やら編集部の大鹿と言います。オリンパスで起きたのは非常にとんでもないことで、得意なことかなと思っておりましたが、今、ウッドフォードさんの話を聞くと、日本で普遍的なものなのかなというふうな気もしております。そこで2つ質問がございます。一つはそのオリンパスの社外取締役がどう機能したかという点なんですが、オリンパスの社外取締役には確か、日本経済新聞の役員の OB の方がですね、2代渡ってついておられると思います。ウッドフォードさんの件はフィナンシャル・タイムズが10月15日に大きくスクープされたということですが、日本のフィナンシャル・タイムズとも言われている日経新聞のですね、役員の OB たち、社外取締役の方がですね、どのようにその機能したのか、会食については、やはり賛成されたのか、そして現在もまだ職にとどまっているのか、そもそも有力紙のですね OB が、そういう格好で、上場企業の監視役に就くというのは非常に異例なことだと思うんですが、そのことをどう思っているのか、これが日経またですね。もう一つ、その日本のジャーナリズムの問題なんですが、ウッドフォードさんの問題が起きている最中に、読売新聞のコーポレートガバナンスが非常に問題になりました。読売新聞でも同じようなことが起きてですね、清武さんという方がですね、ワンマンのボスに反旗を翻したら、あっという間に鎮圧されてしまったと。ほぼ同じ時期に起きた2つの問題なんですが、ウッドフォードさんからご覧になって、日本最大の発行部数を誇る読売新聞で起きたことをどう思っておられますでしょうか。以上2点お考えを伺えませんでしょうか。
何か火に油注ぐのが好きですよね。ありがとうございます。
2点目の日本のジャーナリズムの読売の問題は、ちょっと今回の緊急会見とは直接関与はあまりしていないと思いますけど、ウッドさんの方で何かお答えする点があればという形でお願いしたいと思います。
Okay, I had been looking at the Olympus problem as an Olympus-specific problem, but your comments have prompted me to see it more in a characteristic Japanese context. I have two questions. One question pertains to the non-executive directors. I understand that a former executive of the Nikkei organization was one of the non-executive directors. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how the non-executive director, he and the other non-executive directors functioned. And my second question pertains to very similar problems in regard to corporate governance, which have happened at Japan's largest newspaper, the Yomiuri. As you will recall, they had a man who had just been fired from there who spoke right after you at the Foreign Correspondents Club. And our moderator has suggested that this second question is possibly not germane to our talk here today.
Okay. I agree with the moderator in relation to the second question. But the first question about the three non-executive directors, including the former senior executive from the Nikkei, as you so kindly pointed out. It's a vicious business journalism, isn't it? They didn't function. You see, one of the questions people are saying is the importance of non-executive directors. But having non-executive directors doesn't mean that the right thing will be done. In this case, the three of them all received my communications, all of them, and they were non-executive. They're there to hold the executive to account and to represent the shareholders' interests. But they acted in just the same way. They didn't do anything, they didn't respond, and again they had between the 23rd of September and the board meeting on the 14th of October. Non-executives are important, but to make them effective, you have to have the legislation in place, which means if you have one of these scandals, you can sue them. You know, did they do their duty? Should have they responded to the 6 letters? Should they have responded to the 6 letters? At least allow a discussion at a board meeting. So you have to have the legislation in place where it's not a nice job for retirement and you just turn up once a month and look at the papers. It means that you, if you're a non-executive, you, if things go wrong, have a responsibility, both in relation to civil law and criminal law. So you have to make the non-executive role meaningful. So 3 non-executives who, to quote Supreme Court Judge Kanaka, they were just as much yes men as the executives. They were just the same. So you have to have legislation, which means, in this case, for example, you should sue them. Why didn't you respond? Why didn't you respond to those 6 letters? Without the legal framework of accountability, then it won't work, as it gloriously didn't in this case.
社外取締役についてのみお答えさせていただきますが、どのように機能していたかというと、全く機能していなかったことは明らかです。これで分かることは、じゃあ取締役を設ければいいことあるとは限りません。あくまでも取締役を囲むしっかりした法的な枠組みが絶対条件です。何かというと、社外取締役には一種の監督責任があるんです。つまりシェアホルダーをはじめとするそれぞれのステークホルダーの代表として、社内取締役の、監督ですね。その監督責任を果たさなければ訴えられるはずです。つまり責任を果たさなかった社外取締役が法廷でその責任を追及されるような法的な仕組みがなければ、社外取締役は機能することはできません。
それでは他に質問のある方、どうぞそちらの女性の方。
日本経済新聞社の東間と申します。I'll be asking in Japanese。それで、先ほどですね、オプティミズム一つあるとすれば、今後持ち合い、株式の持ち合いなんかをですね、解消していくというのが資本主義にとってもいいことだというふうにおっしゃっていますけれども、現実にそういうことが、日本の今の社会の中で進みうるのか、その辺に対するそのお考えというのをお聞きしたいのと、あとは、今回こういったオリンパスをめぐる一連の事柄を経て、日本社会っていうのは変わっていく、方向性っていうのを得ることができるのか、そのあたりについても少しお考えをお聞かせいただきたいんですけれども。
I have a couple of closely related questions for you. One is, you've been calling for shutting down the system of cross-shareholdings. But given what you know about the characteristics of Japanese society, business society included, do you really see a realistic possibility of eliminating this system? And two, again, on a related note, what about Japanese society itself? What potential do you see for positive change? And if so, in what sort of direction?
Interesting questions. I think in any problem in life, you have to look at it and face the facts of what it tells you. We had the share price of Olympus down 80%. Yeah, 80%. It related to Tabashi fraud of $1.5 billion. We've seen that the Japanese institutional shareholders have tacitly supported, pretty directly, frankly, the existing directors, and we've seen them not speak one word. So cross-shareholding served this nation well post the Second World War. It made this nation into an economic superpower. The situation is not that anymore. This nation is going backwards. And again, it's not for the institutional shareholders to decide the legislation of this country. They may be very comfortable. It's for the Japanese people. And it would be impertinent of me to say they must do it, they have to. That's your choice. You're a Japanese citizen. I think it should be debated, and I think the country should move in that direction. What do you think it's telling the capital markets, this story? Your Prime Minister, Mr. Noda, spoke out about the Olympus scandal, and I respect him for that. I think he did the right thing. But he said, please don't think that Japan works differently to other capitalist markets. But with the greatest respect, Mr. Noda, it does. what has happened at Olympus with these directors staying in power, again, creates a black comedy. It's a terrible message. Japan needs the best talent, and that might be from within the country, looking at using its female population. There's very few female executives. And it may be using foreign executives like Britain does, or Germany does, or Hong Kong does. How many foreign executives do you think will follow after me? So I think you have to give a long notice period, but a brave politician should start debating it, see what's happened, look at the way the rest of the capitalist world works. So I would start the dialogue. Otherwise, I desperately care for this country, but I think it will go into terminal decline if this cross-shareholding system allows these things to happen.
やはりまず基本は問題を直視することですね。今回の問題は非常に数値化しやすいものです。一時オリンパスの株価は 80% も下がってました。それでもさすがに株式の持ち合い制度の鉄則、その暗黙了解に基づいて国内の機関投資家は沈黙を守り続けました。この株式の持ち合い制度は間違いなく戦後の復興期においては国の役に立ちました。しかし今の時代には役立たなくなりました。もちろんその制度に直接関わっている投資家さんたち、機関投資家にとっては現状維持でいいかもしれませんが、そのマイナス面にさらされている国民、その国民次第ですね。私は立場上で帰ろうというようなことは適切じゃないと思うんですが、皆様に考えていただいて、日本のベストの道を選んでいただくしかないと思っております。やはり先日、野田総理がオリンパス問題に言及してくださったとき、私はとっても感謝しておりました。首相として非常に大胆な発言で、勇気いる発言でした。しかし、発言内容の中に彼は日本は特殊じゃありませんよと、日本の資本市場は特殊じゃないと訴えられましたが、残念ながら失礼ですが違います。日本は特殊です。日本はまだまだ開かれてません。日本は世界トップの経営能力を必要としています。英国のようにドイツのように海外からもトップのマネージャーを迎え入れる必要があります。日本は女性ももっともっと活用しなきゃいけないんです。残念ながらそこまで至ってません。
To answer your second question, Japan has such ingenuity and human talent. And if you look at Olympus, it's the Japanese engineers who design world-beating medical technology. The hard part of running a business, from my experience, is making products customers want to buy. Olympus and many other Japanese companies do that very well. World leaders. But at the senior level, the checks and balances on the board don't exist in the same way. So, as I said in my statement, I feel a greater affection for this country than I did on October the 14th, and I was already a lover of Japan. But the kindness, support, empathy I've had from Japanese people across society at all levels tells me that Japan knows. People say Japan only changes with external influences. I'm not sure that's true. I think if Japan is really to change, it's educated, bright people like you, ma'am, if I can say that, and others who will change this country. And I remain optimistic that, this Olympus story may have pushed the debate, and it's only in retrospect, in maybe a year or 3 years, we look back and did the Olympus scandal change things? And listening to those politicians, I have some hope, a realistic and cautious, but some hope that it will change.
私は製造メーカーの社長を務めてきましたんで、私は全世界のものづくり現場を見てきましたが、日本は本当に世界トップレベルの創意工夫、世界トップレベルのものづくりを誇っている国です。それを私自身を持って言えます。残念ながら日本の経営層は必ずしもそうは言えません。ですから今おっしゃるような改革の原動力については経営層には期待しておりません。むしろあなたのように若くて能力あふれているような方々に期待しております。もう始まっているかもしれません。1年経って3年経って私たち振り返ってみれば、このオリンパスの次元に始まったと言えるように日が来るかもしれません。私はそれを祈る限りです。
はい、それでは同じような趣旨の質問ではなく、新たな質問で、これはぜひ来ておきたいという方いらっしゃいます。そこの一番後ろの方、はい、どうぞ。
ブルームバーグニュースの天野と言います。すみません、ウッドフォードさん、社長に関しては解任だと思うんですけど、取締役は辞任されていると思うんですけれども、現在、その選択を間違いだったと思われていて、取締役に残って改革を進めるべきだったと思われているのかというのが1点と、取締役を辞任された時点でプロ棋士ファイトに勝つ見込みはあると思われていたのか、以上2点をお聞かせください。
You were dismissed as president, but you resigned as a director of your own free will. Do you regret doing that? What are your thoughts about that decision? And when you resigned as a director, what were your thoughts on the likelihood of being able to win a proxy fight?
Yeah. No, I don't regret that. Olympus, the existing directors, had me in a perfect place because I was tied by the obligations of being a director of the company. What it allowed me to do was to speak to potential new shareholders. And it also allowed me to speak in my own capacity to private equity firms, investment banks, and it was because of those contacts that I was able to develop an alternative slate, and I so wish I could have published that because the names on it were so impressive, and that would have given me a positive feeling about Japan. And I became progressively more confident when I saw the people who would be considered for the slate.
私は取締役を辞任したことについては全く後悔しておりません。社長を解職されて役員として残されたのはまさに本当に虚勢の取締役の状態として本当に束縛されてました。私が辞任することによって自由に投資家と話することできました。できるようになりました。私はとっても今になって振り返ってみるととっても嬉しかったのは、自ら進んできた名だたる方々で私と一緒に戦っていきますよとおっしゃってくださった方がですよ。彼らは何名もいらっしゃるし、そのような名簿を皆様にこの場で公表したかったんです。
Just one point which I think is important. You made reference to the Nikkei president, and as I've said, he acted in the same way as the others. But one good thing which came from the Nikkei, in my opinion, was Mr. Abe, who, as you know, is the chairman of Factor. Now, one of the things I made a criticism of you, ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning, and I certainly accept that some of the journalism has been exceptional since then, was that no one in the Japanese media picked up on the Factor publications in July and September of last year, which was my source of information. But one thing I found very depressing when I came back yesterday, I was given an English translation of Mr. Abe, who is, whatever your feelings about him, he has proven to be right. And Mr. Abe published on the 31st of December on his blog. You have to be able to subscribe to get to his blog.
No, blog you don't.
You don't.
No.
So everyone can see the blog. He reported that Olympus had paid for Mr. Kikukawa's luxury flat at 500,000 yen a month after he was dismissed as president, after he left the company and resigned. 200,000 yen for the poodles, and another 80,000 yen in case the poodles do something on the carpet. 750,000 yen paid by Olympus. That, if that had been a similar case in New York, London, Hong Kong, Paris, name the city, that would be picked up by the mainline media. Olympus would be given a chance to respond. Is this true? I mean, they had names, the Olympus stamp, but they would be given a chance to respond, and you would report it. Yet, when I heard that, not one mainline media has reported that story. I felt so sad, so sad, that in the context of the Olympus issue, where Mr. Takayama has said that if directors are found at fault, they would be considered to take legal proceedings, and there the company is paying, according to Mr. Abe, but he sourced it well, and if Mr. Abe was lying, then he can be sued for liable. I don't think he's going to be sued. Why? Please tell me, if I can ask just one question, why is that not picked up here? You know, so only those who look at the Factor blog of Mr. Abe can see that. And I found that really depressing after all we've been through. I found that really depressing.
Did you want to have one more word about your thoughts on what your prospects for winning the proxy fight would have been if you had pushed ahead with that?
I think we had a, yeah,
Okay.
we would have won.
Yeah. で私が先ほど言いましたように私がプロクシーファイトを進めようとしていたとき、協力者として本当に心強い方々集まってくださったんで、彼らと一緒に戦っていけば勝算あったと私は思っております。ただ先ほど申し上げた理由でそのような道を歩み続けるのは不適切だと判断して今日に至りました。なおちょっと横道にそれますが、私が辞任する前に私の同僚だった社外取締役で日経 OB さんについて先ほど指摘がありましたが、この場を借りて日経 OB さんたちはみんな悪い人ばかりじゃありませんよと、特にここで一人をご紹介したいんです。ファクターの安倍さんです。本当にファクターの安倍さんのおかげでここに私たち集まっております。で、私が先日また新たに安倍さんのおかげで懸念材料を提供していただきました。私が昨日日本に着いたとき、私の友人から安倍さんの12月31日付のブログの英訳を渡してもらいました。それは皆さんご存知だと思うんですが、もうすでに辞任している菊川さんですが、彼の白金台の高級マンションの家賃とまたペット代まで含めて月々78万円を会社が負担していることが安倍さんのブログで指摘されました。私は皆さんにここ逆に質問したいんです。どうしてそのようなことをファクターでしか取り上げられないんですか？どうして主流のメディアの方でそれを取り上げてくださらないんですかと。
So please ask Olympus that question. A journalist I spoke to this morning told me they had answered by saying he's going to pay from now onwards. But that's not the point. Why were they paying after a disgraced president who was central to the fraud, why were they doing it? Give them a chance to comment, and if that's not true, then they should pursue that with Mr. Abe. But ask the questions at least. Give them a chance to answer, but ask the questions.
ですから皆様にお願いいたします。安倍さんだけじゃなくて皆様もオリンパスに聞いてみてください。本当に菊川さんの家賃まで負担しているんですかと。間違えたら正してもらいましょう。今朝、あるジャーナリストに聞いてみましたところ、彼女はオリンパスに確認したところ、いや、今後は自己負担になりますと。菊川さん自分で家賃払おうと言われましたと。それが問題じゃありません。実際、オリンパスが負担していたことが問題です。どうして負担していたんですか？それはどうして皆さん追及してくださらないんですかと。
よろしいですか？それで後ろの女性の方。
Hello, ITTV Network, International Channel. My question is, as you said, there seems to be a discrepancy or maybe a different definition of corporate governance or maybe accountability for what CEO does between maybe Japanese way and the international way. Because just before you came to FCCJ, I talked to the ACCJ governor who said there is no Japanese corporate governance functioning or it's not even defined clearly. And then I talked to you, and then next I talked to the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, Mr. Edano. He said the Japanese corporate governance is on par or even better than US, he said. And the top executives of the three economic organizations yesterday quite said the same thing. So what's your definition of corporate governance? And what do you think the Japanese way, or maybe the Japanese style of corporate governance? Can you explain your world's definition and what you saw in Japan?
いや簡単に言えば企業統治の定義づけについて内外の不一致があるように思いますが、また国内でも何か聞くところによって捉え方が違うように感じる時がありますが、ウッドフォードさんとしてどういうふうに企業統治を捉えているか。
I think if you look at the fact that the Olympus scandal has gone on for 20 years, that proves that there's something very wrong with governance. The legislative framework, we talked about non-executive directors, but you should have a majority of non-execs on the board. You should have legislation which makes the non-executives personally accountable, so they really do their job. They should have nothing to fear if they do their job. Human beings are human beings everywhere, including in the United States. He's an American citizen, so I can tease him. But the difference between the United States or United Kingdom or Europe and Japan is when wrongdoing is discovered, you can't carry on in the way it has done. Once wrongdoing is exposed, there's no escape, because people like you, and we've seen, everything from Watergate to the British expenses scandal of the MPs. The media are ruthless. It keeps the democracy strong. And I put in the Japan Press Club my belief that a free press in Japan is the most important element. So Mr. Takayama standing up and saying the payments were appropriate, that could never happen. He would be laughed out. He could not stand up and say he's going and then he's not going. That's something very peculiar. And that comes down to the common sense, instinctive judgment. And in this case, they have had the protection de facto of the institutional shareholders, not criticizing them. And it's they who vote who's a director and who's not a director. So I think the fundamental difference is the cross-shareholding keeps everything comfortable, cozy, nice. No confrontation, no challenge, no takeover. And that, the biggest single strength of effective corporate governance is shareholder activism, not being passive and, in effect, compliant. So as you saw with the American and the British large shareholders in Olympus, they made public statements, very clear, very explicit. These are long-term shareholders of Olympus, not hedge funds. That's the difference. It's what's tolerated. It's what's the level. And people have explained to me what he bowed and said sorry, and in Japan we forgive people. But you don't. If you steal a piece of chewing gum, you go to prison probably in Japan. And senior people, powerful people, well-paid people like me as a director of a company should be scrutinized, challenged, and if we're found wrong, you can't excuse yourself by a bow and an apology. Take the consequences, and that's a cultural norm. What's the cultural norm? So you can have technical discussions, number of non-executives, all these type of issues, but it comes down to really the shareholders being active and what public opinion will deem to be acceptable.
オリンパスの場合、不正が20年にわたって続いたことを見ると、やはり企業統治の上で大きな問題が存在していたことが分かります。で、技術的な話するなら、社外取締役何名いれば、役員の何割ぐらい社外取締役にすべきなのか、どのような法的な制度を設けて、その責任を明確にするか、その議論も必要なんですが、私はどちらかといえば、一番大きな条件は積極的な投資家、積極的な株主ですね。で、積極的な株主というのは、株式の持ち合いの相手先じゃなくて、本当に意味の、独立した立場で企業の経営陣の実績を評価して、不十分であれば声を上げて批判したりすることですね。日本の独特の株式の持ち合い制度においては、暗黙の了解として相手を批判しないことになってますので、いつまでもこの問題の解決が進めないんですね。ですので、ぜひ積極的な株主が増えるような環境づくりを図るべきでしょう。それは企業統治の基本だと思います。
はい、それでは時間も迫ってきましたので、会場からの質問を最後とさせていただきますが、どうしてもという方、じゃあその前、先ほどから手を挙げている今の女性の前の方の男ですね。
One more question.
We'll have one more question.
朝日新聞の記者の牧内と申します。一点だけ教えてください。今回、宇藤さんはオリンパスから突然社長職を解職されたことになりますが、今後、オリンパスを損害賠償請求、訴えを起こすことを検討していますでしょうか。お願いします。
Will you be bringing suit against Olympus for wrongful dismissal?
Yeah. I will most definitely be suing Olympus and making sure that they are held to account for the way they treated me. They dismissed me for gross misconduct. The day I left Japan, I was promoted to the CEO as well as president. The day I came back, when I released the letter asking for the resignations of Kikukawa and Mori and giving them the PwC report, I was fired. Extraordinary in this country, but extraordinary anywhere. And then we've seen what the Supreme Court judge has said about that. So absolutely. But what I would like to say is, if I had come back, this has never been an issue about the money, I wouldn't have sued. I couldn't have sued my own company, So now I'm not going back. Then absolutely I will. I may give a lot of the money to charity, but it is important to me that in a courtroom, if necessary, that what took place was proven to be wrong in dismissing me. And those directors, existing 11 directors, all voted for that. And they've continued to say I was dismissed for anything that. And again, we get back to the ridiculousness of the situation. So I will.
当然です。私はその不当の扱い方をされたことに、その責任について追及していきます。私が称えられて CEO という3文字を与えられた直後に、今度従来の非行というデタラメの名目で解職されました。その解職について第三者委員会もデタラメだと認めています。私は不正を告発したから解職されたと明言しています。私はこの提訴を通じて大金が手に入るならば、その大半を社会貢献活動に投入していくつもりですが、しかし何としてもその責任を最後の最後まで追及するまで続けます。特に私の会食後の高山社長、その他の役員たちの言動に大変不満に思っています。全く不条理のような発言が連発しています。
Just one additional comment. I mean, again, I would like to see, if necessary, in a courtroom, Kikukawa or Takayama or whoever, with an independent judge or jury, argue that I was dismissed for gross misconduct. It would be very entertaining. If necessary, I would go all the way.
機会があれば、ぜひ法廷で菊川さん、拓山さんと会いたいと思います。その場ででも、彼らが私を従来の非行者という勇気あるでしょうか。見てみたいと思います。
どうもありがとうございました。それでは最後になりますけれど、ちょっと情緒的な質問で恐縮ですが、これからイギリスに戻って、まず何かどのような生き方をしたいか、全く後悔をしていないということなのか、何かイギリスでやり残したいというようなことを家族と共にあればですね、そのことを聞かせていただきたいと思います。
ここでやり残して
いやここでやり残すこと、イギリスに帰ってからまずどういうふうな生き方をしたいかということですね。
Could you, with a closing question, I'd like to hear what your plans are for your future life, what you'd like to be doing, what kind of life you'd like to live in England when you get home.
Again, it's only a few hours since I made the final decision, so I think to give any substance to that answer, I need a little time of reflection because my mind has been filled with Olympus for 30 years and none more so than the last 12 weeks.
私は最終的にこの決定に至ったのは本当につい昨夜でしたので、あまり具体的な計画を練る余裕はまだありませんが、
What I would like to do is to say goodbye, firstly to all my colleagues at Olympus. I wish the company well. The company makes wonderful products. That's the hard part of a business. So the engineers, the production people, the service engineers, the sales and marketing, Olympus will go on, and I just hope you get the leadership you deserve. And it's been a wonderful privilege working alongside you, and I'll always have a place in my heart for the company, but most of all its people.
この場を借りて、まずオリンパスの皆さんにご挨拶を申し上げたいと思います。とりわけ生産、研究開発、営業などの現場の方々に本当にありがとうございました。これからも頑張ってください。 オリンパスも不滅だと私は信じております。で、私もいつまでもオリンパスと一緒におります。
And finally, I'd like to say goodbye to the Japanese people. Again, on a personal level, I will definitely be coming back, but the last 12 weeks has shown me the opposite of what I saw in the boardroom. I've been shown great kindness, support, empathy, and I've seen the very best of Japan. This was the year of the terrible earthquake of March the 11th, the greatest earthquake. And being in Japan in the weeks following that accident, again I was humbled and full of admiration for this nation, as most of the world was. So my view as I leave Japan is I have friends here, I will come back. It's a country with unique positive characteristics, polite, gentle, thoughtful. There's so many good, nice people in this country. So I don't leave at all feeling bad about Japan. And as I said, it's a little ironic, but the last 12 weeks has made me feel very close to many people here. And I thank you for your forbearance, tolerating my lack of Japanese. And I wish you all well, and that 2012 is a good year for everyone in this fine country. Thank you.
そして日本人皆様に一言。私は3月11日の直後に日本に戻ってきまして、皆様のその時の取り組みぶりを見て、この国に対する深い敬愛を感じずにいられませんでした。皮肉にも私が会食されてから今までも愛していた日本なんですが、それ以上に、今まで以上にこの国に対する愛情が含まれる一途です。本当に多くの方に親切を見せていただいたりしているし、この国の方々の気配り、ぬくもり、優しさというのは本当に単純そうなんですが、最も基本的な意味での優しさ、私に対して見せていただいた優しさに対して、この場を借りてお礼を申し上げたいと思います。皆様本当にありがとうございます。また皆様にとって12年が素晴らしい年になるように祈っております。本当にありがとうございました。
どうもこちらこそありがとうございました。今日日本記者クラブで、記帳されたウッドフォードさんの言葉はですね、前回来られた時と全く一緒ということですけど、Good to be back with friends というふうに書かれておりますので、今後ともウッドフォードさんの素晴らしい生き方に私たちも敬意を表して、今日の会見を終わらせていただきたいと思います。どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you all.